Today we're at Buildwas Abbey. It's a really nice example of how monasteries were used to control and manage portions of Britain under the Normans. In 1135, this was a quiet valley with the River Severn gently winding through it. Subtle rolling hills, perfect for agriculture. And in 1135, the local bishop decided to found a monastery here, or an abbey. Now, an abbey or a monastery was founded on land. Although it was ecclesiastical, it was a church institution, everything it did had to be paid for. And there was a parcel of land around it, but it wasn't that substantial. And it was quite a small abbey, out of the way. For quite a while when it started out, the abbey was half priests and half laity. But over time, it became more powerful and did it by buying up parcels of land, not by endowments. Quite often, abbeys started with a large parcel of land and were very wealthy, but this one had to build it. In the middle of the 12th century, Abbot Ranulph took control, and he wasn't having it with the small parcel of land. He knew it didn't add up, so he acquired land from the local landed gentry, so the nobles. And soon they owned a large parcel of land, and a lot of land means a lot more money. Today it's all in ruins, but back in the day this was the main church, and the nave and the beginnings of the church were for the lay monks. So they lived there and worshipped there, but they weren't actually priests. They were just normal everyday people who hadn't taken vows, who worked and lived in and around the abbey. And over time this evolved, and by the 13th century there was another wave of land purchasers, and Buildwas Abbey became a wealthy abbey like many did. And it didn't really need the lay clergy anymore, so the non-priests were gently not replaced, and it became a purely priest-led abbey. And you could still see a line inside the main church where the rood screen would have been, the barrier between the nave where everyone was welcome through to the real inner sanctum where only the priests, and in this case monks, took the service. Although there's not much left, you do get a feeling of what a substantial institution this was. It's not as large as maybe Valley Crucis or Hinton Abbey, but this small abbey certainly had a lot of power in this part of the country. The Plantagenet kings wanted to maintain power, and one of the ways they did that was by having monasteries, abbeys, in areas of trouble. Now, this wasn't exactly trouble, but it's kind of in the heading towards the Welsh marches, and it allowed them by the 14th century to control a bit of that area. And they actually were allowed to have secondary child abbeys in Ireland and Wales, specifically so that they would help control the locals, keep them quiet, subdue them. And it was part of the policy of the Plantagenets, because the Normans were ruling Britain, but 98% of people weren't Norman. So they maintained power and influence by having institutions that were under their thumb. And they got that by granting land, granting rights, and just being pally and making sure that the abbot in this case was a Norman. Here we're walking through into the cloisters. It's not a huge abbey. Doesn't take very long to look around, even though it's ruined. Even when it was full, it wasn't a big abbey. Although you get the feeling it was probably a lot larger back in the pre-Reformation days. With the River Severn so close, you have to think that there would have been fish ponds. And certainly there would have been sheep, and they would have had a part in the trade. The church was interlinked with the monarchy, and on the one hand there had to be a balance. So if you look at Thomas à Becket was put in place as Archbishop of Canterbury so that he would control the church, and then he took the side of the church. But they also had wealth. It was a two-sided deal. Now, if you look at King Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, well, he didn't dissolve them because he wasn't happy with the priests. He could have just forced them to move over. He dissolved them because of this. The wealth of the stone, the control of the local people. Local people didn't want to stand against the church. It's different to standing against a king. The church was a separate institution, but very much hand in hand with the king. Here's one of the warehouses to the side, or storehouse it would have been called back then. You have this beautiful vaulted ceiling. And there is a really nice chapter house with beautiful tile floor, but unfortunately it was closed off because it's being repaired at the moment. Could just get a little glimpse of it. Coming back out this dark, cool storeroom. Right next to it is the chapter house, which with the video you can kind of see, but it's a good example, certainly the best tile floor I've seen in one. We'll have to visit Titchfield Abbey. That was a very wealthy abbey, and after the dissolution was given to a local lord, a friend of the king. Just as this land was given by the king endowed to the church, and there was a trade-off that the church was going to pull the party line. Titchfield, they turned it into a house, a palace for the new owner. And the church was used as a barn. For this church, that never happened. There's a house next door which clearly has some links to it in history. But the abbey itself is a beautiful little abbey. Such a quiet spot, there's hardly anyone around. And you can still see the cloisters, the church. You can see where the dormitory would have been, but that's long demolished. Presumably the stones were stolen away by locals. Quite often these sort of buildings, the reason they fell into disrepair was that walls in lesser parts of the building were seen as a great source of stonework. It's much cheaper and easier to pry a stone from the wall than it is to go and dig and cut and dress one from the ground. You have to imagine, you can see where the roof level would have been. So it wasn't much higher than these walls, but you have to imagine the bell tower would have been fairly large. And this is the section where the priests were allowed. Hopefully I'll put the camera down and you can see the little divide there, that line across the church. That's the divide between the laity and the clergy. And it's still being protected. It's protected by English heritage. They have a number of patches there where they're covering up things that are being checked out. And they're making sure it's preserved for future generations. I definitely recommend coming here. Maybe you don't want to go to every abbey, but if you're in this Telford Iron Bridge area, it's a very beautiful little abbey and it's unusually quiet. Most abbeys, they have a village nearby or they're beset by tourists. But this one, it's very quiet, peaceful little spot. It was a bit windy, so I had to turn off the noise. But you can really hear the birds singing. And I imagine it must have been a beautiful spot back when this was fully decorated. There's the divider where the rood screen was. I've always enjoyed abbeys. They're very quiet, peaceful spots with delightful old ruins, and sometimes they're easy to miss, but they're often not that easy to spot without a sign. Here it's down a little lane and we came to it over some fields, but it's still peaceful and calm after 1,000 years. Well, 900 years since it was founded. And even though it's been in ruins since the Reformation, there's still a very peaceful and serene air to it. So well worth a visit. And I'm sure we'll be going to some abbeys and monasteries and ruins of the Reformation in coming weeks. So please do subscribe and make sure to come back for some history on Saturdays.